Hey, thank you very much for everyone for joining us tonight at the Dearborn Public Library. We'll be talking with our author Tim Greiving about his new book on the composer and John Williams in a moment. Just for a couple of quick announcements. First, we got some great programs coming up in the next couple of months. We have ESPN senior writer Seth Rickerson in person about his new book about quarterbacks. And then we have Paul Myers talking about his new book on John Canty. And then December, we'll be talking with historian Rick Ackerson. He's going to be appearing a lot in the new Ken Burns film. Thank you. Ken Burns film about the American Revolution. So please join us. All the information can be found on our library events page. I'll be talking with Mr. Grieving for, say, about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a short Q&A for a format. So Tim's an arts journalist. He specializes in film music. He's contributed stories to NPR, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and the New York Times. He's written program notes and liner notes for film score history. He contributes to the visual history program at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And he's an instructor in film music at the University of Southern California Film School. So thank you very much. Please welcome Tim Greiving.
Thank you for having me.
So I've been listening to and reading up on different podcasts and different articles that you've done to promote the book before, and you had a great story about how you got interested in film scores involving a trip to Orlando.
That's correct. My origin story. My cousins lived in Orlando. My mom's sister and her children lived there, and they were they were a little bit older than us, so we kind of got their cultural hand-me-downs. Whatever they were interested in, we became interested in. And on this particular trip in the summer of 2000, no, not 2000, 1994, my cousin Matt had the Jurassic Park soundtrack on cassette tape playing in the car. And I was a curious 9-year-old and asked a lot of questions. I hadn't seen the movie because I was too young to see it in the theater. So he was just explaining to me what a film score was and what a film composer did. And this guy named John Williams, he wrote the music for Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and he kind of rattled off all these familiar titles. So it was sort of just a eureka moment for me to put a couple pieces together and realize, oh, I do like all that music. I just wasn't thinking about someone originating it, or I don't know. It hadn't crossed my mind what a film composer was. So I went home, bought a Jurassic Park soundtrack on cassette, and the hook was in. And actually, if you can see right here, this is the tape
Holy
that my
cow.
cousin had in the car. He gave it to me last time I saw him, and I was very happy to have this very important relic.
Holy cow. Yeah, that brings back memories. I played the heck out of my Raiders tape and ET soundtracks too, to the point where Raiders there I heard a pause in the chase sequence. It was a pause of music, and it just I played it till probably I ruined them. But so how did you come up with the idea for a book about Mr. Williams?
I guess, I mean, I went into a career as a journalist, writing about film music and interviewing film composers, sort of chased my passion that way. And that led me to writing for, various newspapers and websites and contributing stories to NPR, eventually teaching about film music history. And I always wanted to write a book. I figured a biography of a composer or something about the history of film music would make sense based on my own interests and my own skill set. I'd read a really fantastic biography of Bernard Herrmann that was published in 1991. I want to say I read it much later, but by an author named Stephen C. Smith, and it really inspired me to want to do something similar. There's kind of a dearth of biographies of film composers, especially up until very recently. It's just an art form and a genre, I guess, that's been overlooked by scholars and historians. So there weren't a lot of examples of these kinds of books, but that one really lit the fire for me. I'd like to do something like that. And John Williams has always been my favorite composer, my favorite musical artist, period. So it was sort of inevitable. It made sense to me that I should write a book about him. The problem was he didn't want anyone to write a book about him. So I faced kind of an uphill battle right then and there, but the desire was there, and it only grew stronger as time went by.
Well, yeah, you both in your Substack and book, you detail how it was. It took a lot of effort to convince Mr. Williams to sit down and talk with you. You probably could have gone ahead with it, but it certainly would have been much more illuminating with his cooperation.
I started the project with Oxford University Press, knowing that he probably wasn't going to be involved and that it would be both unauthorized and just no access to the subject, and they were okay with that. I wrestled with that, but made my peace with it and thought, if they want me to write a book about him and they'll publish the book, I think I can write it without him, even though I didn't really want to. But there was a long period of time where that was what the book was going to be. It was just a book written about him with no access to him except any archival interviews he'd given over the years and whoever I could talk to who's in his circle or who knows him. And I worked on the book, researching and writing it for the better part of 2 years without any access to him. So there is an alternative version of the book that is, I would say, much worse. It would have been okay, but it would have been a much weaker, poorer book without his participation.
Well, yeah, you talk especially about his background, where his training ground, essentially, like with review and stuff, uh, where he'd score television shows. Do you think that experience, like uh, Alfred Hitchcock Presents or uh, different things, do you think that sort of helped f refine his musical storytelling?
It definitely made him fast because he had to score a lot of minutes of music every week and orchestrate it by himself and just kind of keep this momentum going for years. So he kind of talks about that period of his life, which is like 5 to 7 years of being on staff writing TV music as kind of a finishing school or grad school or something. So it made him fast, and I think that served him as a film composer, someone who really orchestrates his own music, which not every film composer does. It also taught him just sort of the the ins and outs of different genres, whether it's science fiction or comedy or westerns or whatever. He was doing so many different kinds of shows, including anthologies where it was a different genre. It could be a different genre from week to week, and so he had to kind of develop this quick adaptation of different styles and different idioms and things like that. So that TV period, even though he doesn't look back on it terribly fondly in terms of the quality of material that he was scoring or even his own music, I think he gained a lot of knowledge. And yes, musical storytelling was a big part of all of that.
And you also uh, mentioned that music, there's collective unconsciousness in the music, some instruments, some tones probably that people uh, can always relate to. Do you think that had an effect?
Yeah, I don't know exactly where he started to develop that theory. I know he's a very well read and philosophical person, but he kind of he became interested in Carl Jung and this idea of the collective memory, the collective unconscious, and how we all kind of share a brain of some kind and we share it with our ancestors, and that music is one of the most powerful links to that shared connection. So he believes that the reason certain pieces of music or certain intervals of notes or certain colors of instruments or combinations of instruments, the reason they affect us so deeply, they might make us feel an emotion, or they might make us think of a place or a king or something specific, is because it's tapping into that idea of the collective memory. And I think there's probably something to that, but he articulates that pretty well, and I try to make that a recurring motif in my book.
Well, it was very illuminating to find out he wrote the theme "The Lost in Space." A lot of other work, all the things he worked on in TV shows. You had a clip in your Substack about the theme of The Apartment, and it's like, wow, he's playing the music. He's playing the piano in it, and it just it really, and he was jazz. He was a and did a lot of jazz. It was like mind blown.
Yeah, I mean, he started out with jazz, and I think there's an alternative reality where he was just a really accomplished jazz pianist and arranger, and I think the culture went kind of in a different direction when the Beatles came along, and maybe that wouldn't have been a very lucrative career, but he was very much on that trajectory and had the talent to do it, and he put out some albums, and he played with Henry Mancini and all kinds of interesting people, and yeah, there's a chapter or three or four chapters of his career and life before Jaws, which is kind of when everybody now knows him. That's sort of the starting point for most people's awareness of John Williams. But he did some really amazing and interesting and diverse things before that hopefully the book kind of sheds a light on.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to talk about most people may not know the process, but how does the film, is a musical score added to the film? Uh, like, what is a spotting session? What is a musical cue? Maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, John Williams is an interesting example to shed light on that process, because he started in another era when it was all very analog, and he wasn't even necessarily meeting with the director on certain TV shows or films. He was meeting with the music director, which is a title that doesn't even exist anymore. But the basics of it have stayed pretty consistent. The technology has changed a lot, but typically, if he's going to score a feature film, the film is shot, it's created, it's edited, there's sort of a rough cut or even more than a rough cut of the film done. When the composer gets involved, he'll sit down for a spotting session, which is basically him screening the film with the director and maybe the producer, and he'll have his music editor with him. That's sort of his right hand man who's taking detailed notes. He'll watch the movie with the director. They'll maybe pause it if they want to do that. The director will say, I think we need music here. I think it should start here and end here. Or they'll say, I want it to be kind of mysterious, or I want it to be kind of, maybe they'll give sort of directions on the flavor of the music or what the point of the music in that scene is. The music editor will take all these notes. John Williams will go back to his studio and have this kind of guide for what the instructions are for the music he needs to write. He'll have access to the film in some capacity. It used to be on a moviola. Now it would be maybe on a computer, but he can go look at the scene and then go back to his piano or his writing desk and start writing the music for that scene. And then after he's written some of it, he can go check it against the scene and make sure the timing is right, or he's hitting all the different marks and action beats that he needs to hit, if that's the kind of scene it is. You said a cue. A cue is basically the basic unit of a film score. So there are there could be 100 cues in a film score. The word comes from the idea of cueing. So a certain moment or incident in the film is the cue for the music to start. Um, so John Williams talks about the action of cueing, and that's just the process of starting and stopping and hitting the right marks with the music. But then that came to be the term for the unit of a score. Um, and then he'll demonstrate his themes. He's very old fashioned in this way. This is not how it's done anymore. But he'll have his sort of basic themes for the film ready to show the director. The director will come over. John will play it on the piano and sort of ask the director to imagine what this will sound like with French horns or whatever. Someone like Steven Spielberg is fine with that process. It's a very old uh, artisanal kind of process. It requires a lot of trust that the score is going to sound really great and be the right kind of score and the right kind of tone for the film once you hear it with the orchestra. But that's just how they've always worked. And then when the time comes, they'll get the orchestra together at the scoring stage and record it all, and they'll make changes, and the director will give feedback and say that's not really what I had in mind, or I think it needs to actually be much more subtle here, or that you're not playing the emotion I was thinking that we should have here. And so there's some back and forth, and John Williams is very good at quickly rewriting things or making adjustments right there on the stand, and then it gets mixed into the film. So that's basically how it's always worked. With modern composers, there's a lot more technology involved. They're doing these really elaborate mock-ups with synthesizers and sampled instruments and things, and John Williams doesn't really bother with any of that. But yeah, that's how the sausage gets made, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think a lot of people would know what the process is, so I think they would be interested in that.
Mm.
The well, what he's most famous for is his relation. Well, one thing is his relationship with Steven Spielberg. Uh, they were kind of, you describe it as kind of like a date. They were put together a date. They, Spielberg was an up-and-comer, and I believe it was Jennings Lang said, "Oh, you should meet. You guys should meet and talk." And Spielberg also happened to be a very film score aficionado, so he was excited to meet Mr. Williams.
Well, the legend is, and we should maybe take this with a grain of salt, but I think it's true. The legend is that when Spielberg was a young guy, he was collecting soundtracks as he'd done since he was a kid. And John Williams wrote this score for a movie called The Reivers in 1969. And Spielberg is in, a record shop just thumbing through soundtrack albums, and he sees Steve McQueen on the cover of this record, music by John Williams, who he'd never heard of before. And he puts it on, and it reminds him of the great old film music of the 40s and 50s that he loves so much. It's orchestral, it's extroverted, it's melodic, it's very cinematic and or operatic and all that, which was kind of unusual in 1969. Those kinds of scores weren't really being written much anymore. And the way he put it was, if I ever get to direct a feature film, I want this guy to score it. So when he finally got his chance to hire a composer for a feature, which was the Sugarland Express, which came out in 1974, he asked for that meeting with John Williams. And I always try to emphasize to people, because when you look back at it, the Spielberg-Williams partnership seems just sort of inevitable and perfect and natural, and now they're both old men, old white-haired men. But at the time, Spielberg was, he's like 15 years younger than John Williams, and he was very, very young when they had that meeting. And Williams was already in his 40s, and he had teenage kids, and Spielberg was almost just a little bit older than his kids. So it was an odd couple from the start. And Spielberg was really nerdy about knowing film music, and historic film music, and he knew a lot of John Williams's scores. And I think John just recognized in him somebody obviously who had a passion for this kind of traditional retro kind of orchestral scoring and music and classical music. Spielberg is pretty versed in classical music, which John appreciated. But just someone who was optimistic and romantic and a visionary, and he thought this might be somebody worth working together with. But it wasn't until he saw the cut of the Sugarland Express that he realized this kid is talented and he has an amazing eye, and he's maybe the best director I've had a chance to work with to this point. He'd already been working for almost 20 years, and he'd worked with some impressive directors, but most of them were older than he was, and Spielberg's filmmaking just had such a unique and incredible energy and just visual composition, and the way he staged action scenes and things like that, and heart. It had so much that John just really responded to, and they kind of just were simpatico from day one. And then the next film together was Jaws, and it was sort of off to the races from there. But there, I just like to underline how strange it was that they came together in the first place, even though it seems destined now, and maybe it was destined, but it didn't look normal at the time.
Well, well, at that time, there were two different, they were coming from two different directions. So that's probably why the, it seemed unnatural, but it became natural.
Yeah. The other thing that was unnatural too is that, as I said, that kind of old-fashioned neo-romantic orchestral operatic kind of scoring was really going away. It was becoming the counterculture, rock and roll, ironic kind of use of music. You had Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy and 2001: A Space Odyssey, and just movies that were really doing very different things with music. And the music people were listening to in the late 60s and early 70s was not orchestral music. So it was weird that this young kid who should have been listening to rock and roll would rather be listening to like an old Dmitri Tiomkin score, Alfred Newman score or something. And he wanted this older composer to write music like that for his films. It was very against the grain. And then it was just so undeniably popular and effective with Jaws, and then Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and et cetera, that it sort of turned the tide of what film music, was and should be. But it was unnatural, just like they're coming together, and then it became natural.
Well, then Stephen introduced him to George Lucas, and Star Wars happened.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that 1-2 punch of Spielberg and Star Wars that like turbocharged John Williams's career. And you could argue he turbocharged their careers because he made their movies bigger, better, more emotional, more spectacular than they would have been without his music. And they all kind of rode to glory together. But that was the big moment. I dedicate a whole chapter of my book to 1977, which is the year of Star Wars and Close Encounters, because I wanted to really emphasize that it's these three things, these three entities that kind of changed the course of John Williams's life and pop culture. It changed pop culture.
Yeah, yeah. You also talk a little bit in the book about uh, uh, people say, "Oh, Williams plagiarized other composers like Eric Kleingold or different people," and throughout his whole life, and it's probably annoyed the heck out of him.
Yeah, I mean, I as a person growing up and then going to college, loving him as my favorite composer, I would start to hear, and I didn't go to like a conservatory where I think it's even worse there. I hear horror stories about people who go to Juilliard or different conservatories and what their teachers say about John Williams. But even I heard, yeah, he just rips off Gustav Holst and Stravinsky, and he's not original. And I started to develop this like kind of chip on my shoulder about defending him as my favorite composer. which isn't healthy. John Williams actually tried to help me get rid of that chip on my shoulder, but it's true. And it wasn't just in my head either. I was researching throughout the years of all these things happening from the point of Star Wars on. Every other film review and every time a classical critic wrote about him, there was some dig about him just kind of being a hack or him just ripping off some classical composer, and it was just this persistent noise. So I include that in the book to an extent. I tried not to make that a dominant factor. I tried not to lead
Right.
with that. And I got some really good advice from people about don't go into this defensively of trying to prove that he's a legitimate composer. But I had to deal with it because it was part of the story, and I also give him his say. He kind of has this contradictory quality about saying, I don't worry about the critics, I don't worry about that. When they say this, it says more about them than about me. And he has this kind of Zen attitude about his critics, and yet he clearly is very sensitive about this critique, and gets a little bit defensive, or he did a little bit with me about just how ignorant these people are when they say he's just doing ripoffs of Copland or Stravinsky or whatever it was. And he's obviously thought about this a lot, and it's obviously hurt him a lot. So I tried to kind of weave that into the book as well, but it's an interesting point that I guess we'll keep arguing about it. But I think culturally we've kind of moved away from that being something hung around his neck. It was sort of an old generation of kind of academics and classical critics who wouldn't let this go. I think a lot of people have moved on, and you have people like Gustavo Dudamel and Yo-Yo Ma and many kind of luminaries in the classical world without any ounce of doubt about John Williams's quality as a composer and his importance in culture. So that's made a big difference.
Well, I always think of it, you'll have influences by people you like. It's just making it your own style, making it saying something new.
Yeah, and there are people who are kind of lazy plagiarists. There are film composers who will just lift whole sections of classical pieces and plunk them down, and that should be sort of singled out and called out. But yeah, you're right. You're right. We're all artists are the products of the things that they loved when they were young, or the influences they've had, and it's just a matter of what you do with it. I think he I think he had a bigger target on his back because he was so successful and so famous and so popular. It sort of drew a lot more negative attention than he would have gotten otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. The he maybe let's talk about his compositions, his classical competition compositions, and you bring through the research I did, you sort of emphasize how Williams wanted to use film music to sort of make it make it plausible or acceptable to put it in the classical, like have orchestras play it, not even make it go beyond films, the
Yeah,
music.
I think that happened organically in terms of him presenting the film music in concerts and having major orchestras play his film music. Um, but at a certain point, that became a big part of his life of taking it out of the film and putting it in front of an audience in a concert hall. And how do you do that? And how do you modify the music to make it sort of fit into that world? And then at the same time, he's writing classical pieces like over a dozen concertos, and that's mostly what he's written. But he's written some chamber music. He's written a symphony, and that's a very different style than his film music. But in a way that's unusual for. I mean, there have been film composers like Ennio Morricone or Nino Rota or Miklos Rozsa, different film composers who also have had this sort of second life in the concert hall. Um, John Williams has, I think, done that more successfully than many of the others in terms of not betraying what people love about him in his film music when he writes concert music, but also expressing a different side of himself in his concert music, as well as making the case that his film music belongs in the concert hall if it's done properly.
Yeah, yeah. I it was kind of neat because how you described, I forget what concerto it was, but Williams sort of uh, arranged or made the music in a way that would fit the player's life. I mean, he's extremely sensitive about that.
He is, and it's a very personal thing. It's a relational thing. So he writes these pieces for a specific player, and he has their sound in mind. He has their personality in mind. Sometimes I think maybe you're thinking about the viola concerto where
Yeah,
the violist was married to the timpanist in the Boston Symphony, and he created kind of an argument between the viola and the timpani as kind of a reflection of a marital squabble or something. It's a comedic thing, but yeah, and he gives these to these musicians as gifts. So it's all very relational and very sensitive, like you say, which I think does say a lot about him.
but he also, you talk about he had a reputation as a nitpicker. Very, very, very like almost like, oh, well, you were two beats off. No, not bad you.
Well, he would never say that because he's also very diplomatic. So he's and very considerate. So he is a nitpicker, and he has this kind of extreme standard of excellence for everybody that works for him. So he doesn't let things slide. He doesn't suffer fools, but he also deals with it in this very genial way. And he'll say things to a musician if they're out of tune or something. He'll say, "Your ears are better than mine, but I think maybe might have been a little flat." Or he'll sort of he'll couch his criticism in this kind of complimentary way. So I think he's found this perfect balance of getting a perfect result from musicians while not antagonizing them. He never loses his temper. He's never going to make a scene. He's never going to embarrass somebody. If a musician who's playing for him is really messing up a lot, or they're starting to decline in their ability, or maybe they're goofing around during sessions, he will have them quietly, removed. And that's tough in its own way, but he does it in kind of a respectful way. So it's interesting, his personality and his nitpicker quality.
But it's his first wife, Barbara, when she passed due to an aneurysm, really, really had an effect on him.
Yeah, and I think we knew that. I mean, it wasn't any surprise or secret that she had died, but I think because he didn't really talk about it with most people, including people in his life, he didn't talk about it public, but he also didn't talk about it even with his own children. He kept a lot of that to himself. But I think there was a deep pain that entered his life at that point that partly results in him becoming a very private and guarded person. We wonder, why didn't he want a book? Why didn't he want a documentary? Why was he so private? And why doesn't he talk about his feelings? I think a lot of it stems from that event of just sort of like building this wall to protect himself and his heart and his feelings, because it hurt so much and has continued to hurt. I think I don't think I don't think I'm psychoanalyzing him to say that he never really recovered to some degree from that loss. But he also says he felt like she was with him in a very positive way from that point on, that she was this kind of spiritual force that helped him really focus his abilities and his gifts and know what he wanted to do musically. And so he sees that as a very positive thing. And I say, listen to his music before she died, and then listen to the music that he wrote after she died. And there's just a depth of feeling and passion and poetry and poignancy in his music from that point on. And so I can hear the effect of that in his work, and I think he'd agree with that.
Well, as a sensitive person myself, I could really relate to your description of him, and also, yeah, if that would happen, because I'm also an introvert, so and she introduced him to, I mean, gave her her actions really got him started in his career. She introduced him to the Newmans, uh, and to really power people who have a great effect on his career.
Yeah, which I didn't really appreciate until I talked to him and his daughter Jenny about some of these connections. I did not realize she was the one who introduced him to Alfred Newman and sort of got him in the door there, which was really an important moment in his career as a film composer. She introduced him to the head of Columbia Records, which led to him getting a recording contract. And she was the extrovert, she was bubbly, she was social, and she was also his cheerleader. So she was trying to get him to get out there and meet people and network. And she played such a huge role in the early part of his career of just both getting him outside of his shell as an introvert, but also like she had these connections in show business that she used for him. So she was such an important figure in his life in so many different ways.
Yeah. Uh, let's see. What what current film composers would follow in his footsteps in a way that would sort of work with compositions like he did?
I mean, he is one of a kind, and he is sort of a the last of his kind. So there's no one to one, but I see his influence on people like Alexandre Desplat, the French composer, who really was inspired by John Williams to become a film composer and writes very melodically and has very um, delicate and elegant orchestration. And I think he's trying to work in a similar kind of vein. A younger composer who I think really has taken a lot of the lessons from John Williams is a guy named Ludwig Göransson. His most recent score was for Sinners, but he did the Creed movies, the Black Panther movies, and I think he can write a theme like John Williams can write a theme. I mean, I'm not saying he's his equal, but he aspires to write the kind of theme that you leave the theater humming. And he also knows how to write for orchestra. He has a jazz background, like John Williams has a jazz background. And I think that plays a part in how he is able to improvise on and adopt different musical styles, but still be doing your own thing. I think a jazz person has that ability potentially. So there are people who are honoring certain aspects of what John Williams has done in their own way.
No, it's always hard to answer this question because it's like picking out which one of your kids is a favorite, but what one of his film scores or even one of his compositions had a great impact on you?
Well, Jurassic Park is the origin, and I still have a very soft spot for that. But when I was 16, I saw the movie AI, Artificial Intelligence, that Steven Spielberg directed, and I fell head over heels for that score, and I sort of just adopted that as my favorite child. That's my favorite score of his. I would argue it is a masterpiece. I think it objectively is a masterpiece, but it is my personal favorite too. And I think, I mean, it's hard to rule out 10 other scores that I just hold very closely to my heart, but AI is the one that has the top spot.
There's an entry in your Substack where you talk about how Williams is a big fan of Johannes Brahms, because he doesn't look to the past or something like that. He gave you this biography to read, and I was kind of curious what you thought of it.
It's in that he does look to the past. Actually, he relates to Brahms in that Brahms he contrasts Brahms with Beethoven. Beethoven was a composer who was looking ahead and trying to kind of foresee what the future could be, and invent new music and push music in new directions. Whereas Brahms was kind of backward looking and using the kind of tools and language and form of the classical music that had gone before him. But how can I swim in that world and still make art that is meaningful to me? I think John sees himself in the same light. He's not trying to innovate per se. He's not trying to break rules or come up with some new sound. He really is playing with the tools and the toys of the great orchestral music that went before him, and he sees a simpatico artist in Brahms in that way, and he respects Brahms' music a lot too. And it's there. I think there are people who think, in terms of classical music or orchestral music, if you're not pushing it in a new direction or writing something that's never been written before, then you don't count. And I think he would say Brahms makes the argument that you can still matter as an artist and write music that means something, even if you're kind of following a path that's already been carved out. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's people say, "Hey, you're." Oh, it's kind of like in any profession, research profession. You find the latest drug or you find the latest treatment to advance your profession. It's probably the same thing in music composition.
yeah.
So, just a couple more questions. You mentioned the Kobe Bryant, the Dear Basketball short in your book, and I took a look at it, and it's quite affected by it, both in music and in what Mr. Bryant said about it. Can you talk about how that came about?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny, another unusual uh, team up, but because John Williams wasn't paying any attention to NBA basketball, but Kobe Bryant was a very curious person with a lot of different interests, and like a lot of us, grew up with John Williams's music and loved Superman and Star Wars, and he used that music to hype himself up, and he had this interesting philosophy that he wanted to reach out to people in fields outside of sports for inspiration in his own game. And he thought, well, who's the best film composer ever, or maybe one of the best composers ever? John Williams. Maybe he has some wisdom that he can give me that I can apply to sports. So that's how they sort of struck up an unusual friendship. And then when Kobe Bryant was retiring, he wanted to make films. That was his next project. He had a lot of filmmaking projects going when he died very prematurely, but he did make this short film where he got a great Disney legend animator, Glenn Keane, to animate this short story based on the letter he wrote to the sport of basketball when he was retiring, which is this kind of poignant little um, poem about loving something so much, but realizing you can't do it forever and having to say goodbye to it at a certain point. I think some people saw this short as like a real vanity project for Kobe Bryant, and you could argue that, but it's to me it seems much more pure than that. I like the message of it a lot, and I think John Williams responded to the message of it, and that just sort of the purity of Kobe Bryant's intentions, and the fact that he was reaching out to this older kind of analog, handcrafted artisan to work on his film. He wanted it to be this sort of timeless thing. So I, it's a short piece of music, but it's really emotional. There's this really nice arc to it. It's one of my
Yeah.
favorite things he's written in the last 10 years or so. It shows so cuts right to the heart, and it conveys the message of the short, which is this loving something sometimes means knowing you have to let it go. And of course, it took on a different kind of an extra dimension of poignancy when Kobe Bryant died. So it's a special little project. And I was fortunate enough to be able to be there and interview Kobe Bryant, interview Glenn Keane, you know, when it was all happening. So I was able to put that into the book.
And one more question. Well, maybe just a comment. I kind of admire how you yourself kind of carved out a career doing liner notes or doing talks or doing books or doing teaching and stuff. Is there a favorite thing that you like to do?
I have to say interviewing is my favorite thing. I love to write. I like to teach. Um, there are different facets of what I do that I enjoy, but I just love the conversation when I get to interview artists that I admire. It's exciting to meet them, of course, but it's really fun to just have the opportunity to pick their brain and to tell them why I appreciate what they do and to understand their process and you know all the things you can sort of um, drag out of a good conversation. So that is has always been and is my favorite part of what I get to do.
Yeah, I can relate. I like doing these and telling people like David Zucker, thanks for all the laughs. Stuff.
Yeah.
All right, let's do a short Q&A. Anybody have questions online? You can just add through the chat. Did you have a question, sir? Yeah, go ahead.
There are not a lot of books, biographies. I'd be interested in writing a book on Hans Zimmer.
Yeah, the question is, and you talked to Hans Zimmer, got a question in the audience about writing a book about him. Uh, would he be as receptive as John Williams?
I would think he'd be way more receptive, which I Hans Zimmer does not mind talking about himself. He's a very, you know, gregarious and open person. So I think he'd be all about having a book about him. I really like him and I like talking to him. I wanted to interview a number of other composers about John Williams to get their perspective from different generations. And Hans Zimmer had so many really interesting insights. I quote him quite a bit throughout the book just because he's got a great way of putting things. He's a great speaker, but he really knows John Williams music very well and not just the big hits. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to writing a book about him, and I don't think he would be opposed to having a book written about him. So, don't rule it out.
And did you have any more questions?
One more than I'd like to hear what you would say about understanding jazz. I mean, if you were instructing someone that doesn't have a jazz background, what level of jazz and what level of jazz is needed? Or do you mean advanced jazz theory? I mean, what makes the jazz skill in a film score so powerful?
Did, did you ever ask, he's asking about the level of jazz, uh, how it's what makes it powerful in a film score? Uh, what is it fitting into the right atmosphere? Say like Anatomy of a Murder comes to mind, or is it the performance? What is your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, there's the literal use of jazz music to kind of convey the atmosphere or the time period or the subject matter as being the jazz world, which you know in the '60s was often related to crime or nightlife or things like that. But in terms of just like philosophically how it influences film scoring, the composers who have a jazz background talk about the improvisational nature of jazz is really useful. They start the process of scoring a film by improvising. Maybe they're at the keyboard, or you know, in some cases the guitar, or even it's in their head, but they're able to improvise on an idea pretty quickly because that's what you do as a jazz musician. So I think just that part of your brain and that kind of muscle memory is useful in just generating ideas. And a film composer is reacting to what they're seeing. They're reacting to visual storytelling and dialogue and imagery. And so that kind of jazz method of improvising and reacting, I think, is useful. And in the case of John Williams, there's a sense of just like groove and propulsion, a rhythmic quality that I think comes from his jazz background that's really useful to keep the film moving and just keep the pace going. And again, like I said about comparing him to Ludwig Göransson, someone who writes jazz charts is often taking and arranging someone else's tune, or maybe it's their tune, but you're doing it in different people's styles. You're kind of moving it through different languages and idioms. I think a really good jazz arranger can do that, and that's really useful as a film composer to not just be stuck in one style of your own. You can kind of be a chameleon in all kinds of styles. So that's how I would answer that, I guess.
Oh, that's a good answer. And finally, you mentioned how Mr. Williams always kept had a guard up. He would talk about a lot of things, but there was you never got the sense to know him. Is that still the case, or is that the case?
I mean, yes, to a certain extent. I don't think he certainly didn't let me in completely. I think there are probably people in his life who he lets in much more. He's very close to his daughter, Jenny. And he's had friends like Andre Previn, like Lionel Newman, who I think he did really drop his guard and talk about heavy things and personal things with. I was his kind of young, dumb, persistent nuisance biographer. So he probably was selective with what he shared with me. And there were certain things I didn't probe about just out of, sensitivity or, decency, I don't know, dignity. But I do think he revealed more of himself than I ever expected him to. I think he answered questions that I didn't necessarily expect him to answer, and he told me stories I was kind of shocked that he told me. So I don't know. I'm grateful for how much I did learn about him and how much he did reveal about himself. And I tried to put all of that into the book. And I hope, maybe my favorite compliment of the book is I feel like I know him now. And that it's a simple sort of objective, but that's really all I wanted people to get out of this was I feel like I know him now.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So, well, thank you, Tim. Thank you very much for talking with us, spending the time with us. Uh, Tim's book is available at all good bookstores, and good luck with it, and good luck in your future.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah. Take care.
You too.